civilized discourse based upon academic analysis and thought, and considering the other person's point of view, and conceding that from time to time there may be someone well to our left or right, and of whatever race, color, or creed they happen to represent, that might actually be adding something to a conversation or a process. That's being lost in this current American situation, where this Trump-Biden debacle has brought us, I think, to an all-time new low in terms of the kind of thing I remember as a kid. When I'm just old enough, I was 5 years old when my parents were watching John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon on television in those televised debates. And when you go back and look at films of those, these guys were absolutely stellar compared to the kind of garbage that the average American is being subjected to today. So it's why I'm in alternative media. It's why you would never see me in mainstream media, because I've found, particularly with a show like this one, just being one example, that this is where thoughtful Americans across the political spectrum I have been hunting for good news and good news sources and good thinking and good analysis for a very long period of time, because especially since 9/11, the American political scene has become increasingly polluted. You've got basically 6 major media consortiums since the Clinton years, when all of these different media groups were involved in these mergers, that have created a false dialectic between establishment right and establishment left that basically has concealed from the average American who and what it is that is controlling this country and running it, much to the detriment of the average person. And this is where we get into things like fiat money and the Federal Reserve Board. This is where we start to get into discretionary wars that have nothing to do with our true national defense. This gets into questions about COVID-19 and vaccines and so forth, where I'm struck by the fact that Americans ranging from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his children's health defense over to someone like Ron Paul are saying in many cases a lot of the same things in regard to this tendency and this movement toward a world government, frankly, that is benefiting a few people at the expense of most of the rest of us. And in terms of this present situation going on with the Republican and Democratic parties, it's difficult to determine which of the 2 major political parties and political party nominees for the presidency of the United States is more dangerous on this issue of war and peace, and on behalf of whom. I find it incredible, for example, that I think it's Michael Rechtenwald, the so-called anti-PC prof that you'll find on Twitter. He had a major post on RT, Russia Today, recently, just in the last 2 or 3 days, that was making what I think is a very strong case for the fact that Joe Biden is even in more deeply with the deep state and the Zionists and the neoconservative war party than Donald Trump is, and is one who voted for Trump 4 years ago and did so hesitatingly. Trump, among the many things that he has completely balled up, in my view, has been the national security of this country, where despite his so-called America First platform, it looks increasingly to me like an Israel First platform, much the same thing that you're going to get if Biden and Harris are elected. And what I see in the longer run for this country is a movement toward a wider war in the Middle East for all of the wrong reasons, for all of the wrong forces that will push us into it. And this is not the kind of political discourse that we should be engaging in mainstream media and in these presidential debate formats and so forth, that's very possible on a show like this. It's for those of us who are involved in outlets like yours, we just shake our heads and lament the fact that political discussion and thought and consideration of alternative points of view has largely been savaged.
So in this atmosphere that we have in America right now, why do you think it seems to most people who are looking from the outside looking in that Trump just goes with the wind? I mean, his policies are just on the whim or whatever like that. Because I want to play something for you. It's about it may be like 2 minutes, but this is an example of him doing such things. So I'm here. I want to share the screen. Goes here, and I want to here we are, and I'm about to play it for you. Here it is. This is the commercial, and then here it goes. Can you guys hear it?
Yes.
Okay, just listen to this. Look at on here.
President's tweets certainly threw yet another curveball into the prospects of a new relief package. Just yesterday afternoon, the president had said that the White House's offer of $1.6 trillion in aid was very generous, and he accused House Speaker Nancy Pelosi of negotiating in bad faith before he shut down the talks. But very shortly after, some moderate Republicans, including those in very competitive districts, urged the president not to walk away. GOP Congressman John Katko is in a dead heat with his Democratic challenger in central New York. He tweeted this: "With lives at stake, we cannot afford to stop negotiations on a relief package," and he strongly urged the president to rethink this move. Meanwhile, Susan Collins of Maine, who is in danger of losing her seat, called walking away a huge mistake and said that she could call the Treasury Secretary to register her complaint. Now, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell had thrown his support behind the president's decision to stop the talks. He said that Democrats had never made a reasonable offer and that they would re-engage after the election.
I think they were pretty close to a deal on paper. 1.6 trillion was a good offer. I think it's political malpractice for President Trump to pull out of those talks, even if he was getting strung along to an extent. Now, 1.6 was a great offer. 400 billion to government's $400 a week and unemployment benefits. I think that was a great offer. For Democrats, that's a publicly pulled out. Take the blame for failing. Is political malpractice. And I think the evidence of that is now that Trump asked for peace corruption, ready to sign checks, etc.
So I cut it because I want to address that, because just hours before that he was pushing and saying that the country was in trouble and we needed more stimulus, and within just like a couple of hours he just pulls out. I mean, what does that say about him as the president, and what does that say about his policy making? Because it seems as that he does things on a whim.
Well, let me give you an example of what I think is Trump at his most dangerous. On the 3rd of January, you had General Soleimani, the Islamic Republic general of Iran, assassinated in Iraq. Now, President Trump publicly admitted that he was behind that he commissioned that. This was clearly a crime. I've said this repeatedly, in the Tasnim news agency and press television of Iran is an anti-war conservative. I'm on the political right in this country historically. I'm talking about the Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul right. And I found the president's actions in this situation not simply to be criminal, but the president in this circumstance was relying upon some really terrible neoconservative advisors that he had surrounded himself with, who appear to be a continuation of everything that has gone wrong with American foreign policy, especially since 2001. But to actually order the assassination of a foreign general, a foreign leader that we are not in a formal state of war with, is a literal crime. And for the president of the United States to admit that he had done this, and for his political base largely to have supported such an action is simply beyond the pale for me. And I emphasized to the Tasnim news agency at the time that I believed it was criminal. It was not simply criminal in terms of the premeditated assassination of a foreign leader that we are not technically at war with, the Israeli lobby notwithstanding, but the fact that Trump commissioned this assassination to take place in a third country, Iraq, that was not on board with this and had not been consulted in any way, shape, or form, made it an international crime against two different countries. And it was not only a rash and absolutely immoral and illegal thing that Trump did in that situation, but he seems to have, and his advisors seem to have, no consequences of the blowback that is going to occur as a result of having done something like this. I lived in Iran years ago, as we may have talked about at the beginning of the hour. My father was a senior advisor over there years ago during the last years of the Pahlavi regime. I have a lot of Iranian friends across the political spectrum, and almost to a person, they understand that regardless of their differences with one another, that this was a heinous criminal act. It was a violation of international law. It was a violation of Iranian autonomy and sovereignty in a way that is probably the worst thing that the United States has done since the 1953 coup d'etat in that country, which overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, that is now popularly known as Operation Ajax. It became the CIA's primer for all of these illegal regime changes that the United States has attempted and in some cases has been successful in pulling off in all the years since. So that was the 3rd of January when, just out of thin air, Mr. Trump, having already unilaterally pulled this country out of this JCPOA P5+1 treaty with Iran. And by the way, along with Pat Buchanan and David Stockman on the right, and Philip Giraldi, the ex-CIA station chief, who's now the head of something called the Council for the National Interest. These fellows are all more prominent than I, certainly. But the point is, we all supported the treaty. We felt it was in Iran's interest and the ultimate interest of the United States to come to terms with this treaty. Trump, listening to these radical neoconservative kooks like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, just to name two, unilaterally pulls the United States out of this deal. And I've gone on record as a man of the right in saying that I think this was Barack Obama's chief achievement during President Obama's time in office, that we were able to finalize this deal and to go into it. Trump unilaterally pulls us out of it, not simply breaking his word to Iran, but breaking his word to the other signatories to the treaty and ignoring the best intelligence that 16 American intelligence agencies had submitted up to that point that indicated that beyond a shadow of a doubt, the Iranians were upholding their end of the deal in the treaty. So what does Trump do? He unilaterally pulls us out of that treaty because Pompeo and Bolton and Bibi Netanyahu of Israel, operating in a completely different wavelength from the rest of us, wanted him to pull out of the treaty. And then Trump proceeds to engage in all kinds of economic sanctions against Iran that Congressman Ron Paul had publicly and correctly said were acts of war. And then on top of all of this, Iran is not simply made to be the bad guy for having upheld its end of the deal, but Trump, having broken the word of the United States to Iran and to these other nations that were a part of the deal, ignoring his own intelligence community, then proceeds not only to engage in economic sanctions against Iran and to engage in military deployments that look increasingly threatening around the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. But then on the 3rd of January, he commissions this premeditated extrajudicial execution of a foreign general of a country that we are not formally at war with, which is a criminal act under international law. Now, that to me is about as reckless as it gets, and I have maintained consistently and continue to maintain publicly, and have said so with the Tasnim news agency and also press television, as well as with the Sputnik International of Russia that's talked to me from time to time, that this is not only criminal activity, but it gets into the very thing that I think you're suggesting, Rashid, and that is that this guy is not necessarily playing with a complete deck of cards to be doing things like this, reckless advisors or not. Most of us, I think, hopefully have enough moral and ethical and political sense to grasp the fact that the president of the United States should not be doing things like that. And to the extent that he not only did it, but was proud of it and admitted that he had commissioned it, he has set up a situation, and I'm well aware of this because of the number of Iranians that I know in their state media and from watching the reactions of a lot of people in the Middle East on Twitter and so forth. The Iranians are not going to forget this any more than we would forget it if their government commissioned the assassination of an American general. We would not tolerate that. We would see that as a casus belli to go to war. In this particular situation, however, the Iranians are just expected to take this and to shut up. So in this particular circumstance, to me, once again, and I said so publicly at the time, I felt that the Democrats' case for attempting to impeach Trump on the charges that they drummed up were largely absurd and would not wash in terms of a conviction. However, if the Democrats had chosen to draw up articles of impeachment against Donald Trump for this Soleimani assassination, I've gone on record publicly in international television shows from time to time that as one, if I were theoretically sitting in the United States Senate as a Republican senator looking at those charges and knowing that those charges are in fact true, I would have voted to convict him.
Now, on this, before I bring Rashid in to ask a question, I want to revisit a few things you just said about, especially about the assassination of Soleimani.
Sure.
Because from sources that I have, they were telling me that he was actually there at the behest of the Iraqi government, and that he was supposed to meet with some Americans too, on the issue of ISIS, and that America lured him over there to assassinate him. Now,
exactly. And I believe that my sources have told me that. I believe that to be absolutely factual. So in this particular case, Soleimani, who along with people like Syria's President Assad, have been absolute bulwarks in the attempt to destroy Sunni Wahhabic extremism in the Middle East, an extremism, by the way, that is being supported by the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, just to name three, in an anti-Iran network that has been set up. But you're absolutely right. Soleimani arrived in Iraq and fully expected to be meeting behind the scenes in back channel diplomacy with both the Iraqi and American representatives in a secret chat that was designed to come to some gentleman's terms, perhaps, in terms of what could be done to emphasize any areas of mutual agreement that we might have. And this was the pretext for setting him up in this despicable assassination. Now, again, when you start talking about this, it's not simply immoral, it's not simply evil, it's not simply a violation of international law, but the Iranians have had 2,500-year-old history. For anyone who's studied anything about their history from the time of the Achaemenid Persian dynasty of the Old Testament on forward, the Iranians have a 2,500-year history of being able to successfully deal with foreign occupiers and with foreign exploiters of their national autonomy. And for the president of the United States to have done something like this, the question is not whether or not there will be a draconian blowback price to be paid for this. It's a question of when and how. And when this thing came out on the 3rd of January that Trump had done this, again, I think it is the best example, or the worst, if you choose to say that, of a man who is visceral, who has an element of the mercurial to the point of being imbalanced, and who is listening to advisors. As I said to my older brother, who happens to be, by the way, a Democrat and a very distinguished jurist, I said to him off the record, you know, these foreign policy people that Trump has been picking, you couldn't pick worse people if you went to the phone book and just looked up a random 10 names. These are people that look even crazier than Cheney and Rumsfeld. So in that regard, I think we're touching upon the nerve of what is truly wrong in this country. And in a most serious vein, Biden and Harris have given every indication, of course, that they're a part of the war party, that they are essentially supporters of neoconservative and Zionist ideology, even if they try to tone down the rhetoric on it. And I said to my wife a year or two ago, when Kamala Harris was not speaking at the American Israel Public Affairs Committee National Convention, but went there and met with Netanyahu behind the scenes and was subsequently featured on Bibi's Twitter account with all of these photo ops where they were seen together posing for these pictures. I said to my wife, "You're looking at someone who has just been selected to be on the Democratic Party ticket in 2020. And when you look at the Democratic Majority for Israel organization, you look at the connections of Joe Biden with a significant element of the deep state, including the former CIA director, Michael Hayden, who has just endorsed him. These are truly ominous times in which we are living. And when we start even considering that Michael Rechtenwald, the anti-PC prof, might be correct, that Biden is even more deeply involved with these people than Trump, it really causes us to take a deep breath and to wonder if we're not living in the last days, not only of the American empire. That might be merciful for that to be the case. Frankly, I'm a supporter of the American Republic, not the American empire. But we could be talking about the survivability of the planet with some of these folks that have such incredible influence in both of the major political parties. And I think it's the issue of the election, and no one is really addressing it for, I think, some very obvious reasons.
Yeah. And it's like I said, I'm going to bring Rashid in, but it was like a 3-part question that I need to ask. And you answered me, but I wanted to go back to something that you said. And you were talking about when the United States illegally and unlawfully pulled out of the JCPOA, right? And
Yes.
and how you were saying that Trump doesn't think about the ramifications of the policies that he enacts. And I want to bring something up here. I'm going to bring it to line. I just want you to listen to John Kerry. John Kerry, the former Secretary of State.
Yes.
I'm going to bring it to you. Let me see. It takes me a second to let me get stop screen. Okay, we'll bring it right here. Give me 1 second. Here we are right here. And I want you to see this, and I'm going to play this for you. And listen what John Kerry said, and everything that he warned and about when it comes to the JCPOA. It seems like Trump just ignored everything that he warned, because he was talking about that the dollar hegemony or
Yes.
hung by a thread, and if America did this, did that, then this would spell the end of the dollar. And Trump comes in and he does exactly what John Kerry said would spell the end. I just want you to listen to this. This is a 3 minute and 48 second clip.
Exactly.
All right, here we are, right here.
Folks, they are a professional nation today. They became that. And they became that while we had a policy of no enrichment. That country is master the fuel cycle.
People say, oh, get the 5 plus 1 together again and negotiate a better deal. And you're beginning to deal with that, but you deal with the problem of getting that 5 plus 1 again to get on the same position.
I stopped there for 1 minute because remember, Trump has said the exact same thing. The exact same thing.
Yes.
Now we'll go further.
One of the reasons, Sir Harry, that we felt it was important for this negotiation is the fact that sanctions was already framed. Remember, we don't trade with Iran. We have a primary embargo. And by the way, the primary embargo will stay. But if everybody thinks, oh no, we're just tough, the United States of America, we have our secondary sanctions, we can force people to do what we want. I actually heard that argument this morning. I heard it from a number of the organizations that are working here in post spreading the word. America's strong enough, our banks are tough enough. We can just bring the hammer down and force our friends to do what we want to do. Now look, a lot of business people in this room. Are you kidding me? The United States is going to start sanctioning our allies and their banks and their businesses because
Isn't that what Trump is doing now? I stopped it again because isn't that exactly what he's doing now, threatening his European partners and threatening everyone who disobeys the U.S. dictates? This
Oh,
is
no
what's
question about it. And it's not simply with Iran, but look at the complete breakdown in American Russian relationship since the end of the Cold War, and especially in recent years. My father was a U.S. intelligence officer at the height of the Cold War. He was in the United States Air Force, the organization that he worked for about a dozen years at the very height of the Cold War. Was involved with the Francis Gary Power U-2 spy incident and all the rest of it. And it was widely believed after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and if we go back that far in the political stream, we have to remember that it was Ronald Reagan who had engaged in some very meaningful arms negotiations deals with the former Soviet Union. And it was George Herbert Walker Bush in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall, who promised Mr. Gorbachev that the United States would use this opportunity with the demise of the former Soviet Union to herald a new day in American-Russian relationships. We would not attempt to recruit Warsaw Pact countries into NATO, said Mr. Bush. We would abide by treaties like the INF Treaty. We would not engage in attempts to move American and NATO assets closer, military assets closer to Russian borders. We would not attempt to encircle Russia, and we would be in a position, hopefully, to where both the United States and the Russians, with the end of the Cold War, to mutually begin to reduce the incredible expenditures of our respective military-industrial complexes and move on to a better day. What has happened since? Both with Bill Clinton onward, through every American president that we have had since that time, and most obviously now with the last, with Bush 2, and with Obama, and with Trump, we have seen a series of promises broken to the Russians that have made the present foreign policy of the United States toward Russia an absolute beacon of instability and irresponsibility, much as we have done with the Iranians. It doesn't take a real genius to look at the number of Warsaw Pact countries that have been recruited into NATO to recognize that there's an issue here. We keep having military exercises ever closer to Putin's borders. We continue to be involved in pulling out of treaties like the INF Treaty unilaterally and the ABM Treaty with Russia unilaterally. And then, of course, there's the whole question of something that was facilitated by Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Victoria Nuland, and that was the illegal coup d'etat in the Ukraine in February of 2014 and the overthrow of the Poroshenko regime, which has led to a circumstance now where the Russians are very much aware that on their southern underbelly, especially with the situation in Ukraine and the diabolical mess that the United States has made of both Libya and its illegal activities in Syria, that this whole question of a new day in American-Russian relationships after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that's over. That's squandered. We're in a circumstance now where, on the basis of American activities in these last several presidential administrations, including the current one, where when Vladimir Putin speaks, and he's a very careful fellow, but when we start seeing articles appearing in Russia Today and in Sputnik and in TASS and so forth and so on, heralding the latest Russian advancements in hypersonic missiles that travel at a number of times the speed of sound, it doesn't take a real genius to figure out that this is in response to all of this American jingoism in the Persian Gulf and in the Eastern Mediterranean and around the Black Sea, as well as at the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz, not to mention all of this American and NATO naval monkery that's going on in the Baltic region. These are reckless policies. This is not national defense that we are talking about here. And the most unbelievable aspect of it is that many of the leading advocates of NATO recklessness in continuing these policies have actually signed on to support Joe Biden. It's unbelievable to me that 300 ex-aides of John McCain of Arizona. And by the way, John McCain's entire political career was financed by his wife, Cindy Hensley McCain, whose father in the state of Arizona was a bagman for the Meyer Lansky Israeli crime syndicate. That is a very, very sordid situation, of course, that mainstream media has helped the McCain empire to keep largely silent for the American public. And, of course, the whole McCain state funeral heightened all of the things that supposedly this fellow had done in his life, which not only obscured his father-in-law's relationship with the biggest mogul in the Israeli crime syndicate in the United States, who had, by the way, if you read Michael Collins Piper's book, Final Judgment, and look at what Lawrence Guyano has written for the Unz Review, Meyer Lansky and David Ben-Gurion played a direct role in the assassination of John Kennedy. Now, that sounds like a rather extreme thesis until you look at the evidence, but nonetheless, that's the McCain lineage. And why is it now that Cindy McCain and 300 ex-aides to the late John McCain have made no secret of the fact in all of these media outlets, including Axios.com, where Cindy McCain was interviewed recently, they are embracing Joe Biden as General Michael Hayden, the former head of the CIA under George Bush, did today. This is very, very disturbing because when you start looking at the incredible irresponsibility in the American-Russian relationship, not to mention the Iranian, just focusing again on Russia for a moment, that has really gained a tremendous amount of steam from Bill Clinton onward, it begs the question as to why the American public continues to